Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. My guest this week is Adam Morgan, who's founder of a marketing consultancy, Eat Big Fish, which popularised the term challenger brand. And this interview took many months to arrange and to execute, partly because of logistics reasons and also because the technology let us down several times. And as a result of this, I actually went back to the book, his latest book, many times actually. This is a book called A Beautiful Constraint, How to Transform Your Limitations into Advantages. And the book, it does exactly what it says on the cover. I mean, I read it several times and I do refer to it reasonably frequently now because there are some great tools in here, some great distinctions and great great ways of looking at the world, which has significant benefit both professionally and also personally. So the interview is a little bit longer than normal, but it's well worth listening to in its entirety. And I also recommend the book as well. There's lots of things that you're going to pick up here, but I mean, I was fascinated by how well-known companies that he's worked with use what he calls propelling questions, which combine ambition and constraints to really transform their business. Secondly, I was interested in how he works with companies to help them develop the capability in their organization for people to be more innovative and inventive, to develop this resourcefulness, which he refers to. And thirdly, in his story of how he actually launched the book, he was with zero budget. They nonetheless managed to, have a 2-week long launch program across 14 cities in the US, working alongside companies like Google and Fast Company, and a remarkably successful launch, but starting with a budget of zero. And he was able to practice what he preached and tap into these the resources, notwithstanding the enormous constraints of zero budget. So there's lots in here. I think you'll find it fascinating. In many respects, this book is all around mindset essentially, and it's hugely powerful given the tools and given the methodologies and the insights that he comes up with. So I hope you enjoy the show. Now, before we get into it, just like to remind you to join thousands of other business leaders to access resources and tools to make themselves and their organizations more innovative and entrepreneurial. Go online to www.innovationecosystem.com, sign up for those resources, and I hope you enjoy the interview with Adam Morgan. Hello, this is Mark Bidwell from the Innovation Ecosystem. With me today is Adam Morgan, who is the author of a lovely book called A Beautiful Constraint, How to Transform Your Limitations into Advantages and Why It's Everyone's Business. So welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you very much. And I should just note that I'm in fact the co-author with Mark Barden of the book, who's my San Francisco partner who brought his West Coast perspective to it.
Great. I should have clarified. Thank you for that. So you work with some of the largest, best resourced companies in the world, companies like Unilever and Nike and Toyota. And yet you write a book about constraints. And this is kind of counterintuitive to me. So, I mean, can you just explain how you landed on the overall topic, given the background of the kind of clients you work with?
Yeah, my background is actually in challengers and challenger brands of all sizes. Either very large players who, as you described, wanted to get back to rediscovering their challenger DNA for a particular time in their life or a particular challenge, or indeed much smaller players who genuinely were starting out as challengers and taking on big established players and big established categories. And I'd written a book about strategy a long time ago called Eating the Big Fish, which was about a kind of strategic approach. And then I'd written a book about culture. And I always wanted to write a third book about challenger innovation. And one of the things that struck me about challengers was very often they are very innovative and they have to innovate, despite not having a fundamental of what would normally be regarded as a good innovation practice. They might not have an innovation department, for instance. They might not have an R&D department. They might be thin on kind of insights or indeed the kinds of partnerships you require to scale. And yet, they become and continue to be some of the most creative forces in business around. So how is it that they manage to be innovative in the face of those constraints? Was the way that I started. as we researched the book more and we got sort of deeper into the interviews, we first of all extended beyond just business and strategy into agronomy, into education, into healthcare, into a wide variety of different fields that seem to be really interesting and important for us as societies and as kind of citizens of the world, but also increasingly into things like parenting and how it affected us as individuals, because we wanted this book to be a handbook for our children going out into a world where actually how you manage your constraints and how successful you are at managing your constraints will define not simply progress but happiness for us in our business lives, in our personal lives, and indeed as citizens of the planet, I think.
And I mean, I'm thrilled you mentioned that, because as I said when we in a pre-conversation, I mean, when I first read this, I thought this is a marketing, a branding book, given your heritage. Then I looked at it again and thought this is the kind of book that if I was running a large project, a change project in an organization, I'd like to read about. And then I looked at it again and thought this is a kind of a personal development guide. And so, the context of of that journey that you just outlined is bang on, and I think it's fascinating because it is a multifaceted book. So my question, I guess, is, I mean, at the heart of the hypothesis is that the constraints are not limitations, but are resources, if you like. So maybe you could can you just explain the 6 steps and the sort of the central thesis, or maybe the journey that you take people through on the book. And then maybe we can dive into 1 or 2 of those to really get a sense of what that looks like in the marketplace, in some of your clients, and perhaps even in some parts of your life.
Yeah, so I mean, the starting point really is that constraints have a bad rap. If I asked you to do word association around constraints, the things that would come up would be they are things that limit your ability to be what you would really like to be or what you could really be. And yet, within certain professions, engineers, software designers, for instance, constraints are seen as absolutely fundamental to problem solving. And indeed, you can't really start solving a problem effectively unless you've got those constraints as parameters around the problem. And more particularly, outside those particular professions, each of us individually in some sphere of our lives knows and understands that constraints are a good thing. It might be in the sport that we do. That's more fun because of the constraints. It might be in the Sudoku puzzles that we do, or the musical forms that we study, our love of Bach, for instance. We will understand that. We just don't translate that sense that constraint is stimulus to more, as a stimulus to more creativity and more possibility into the rest of our lives, and particularly also into our business lives. And so I was really intrigued about why that was. And so with Mark, we set out to kind of explore, well, there must be a body of human knowledge about how to transform constraint into possibilities. Why can't we see if we can just identify what those are and create just enough of a process, not a formula, but just enough of a process to help people deliberately move themselves and move other people on from one stage to another. And so we started out with the hypothesis that actually, there were a few people that were really good at this, and we called those transformers, and there were some people who just didn't think it was possible, and we called them victims, and there were some people in the middle who could kind of kludge it, as the West would see. They come up with kind of quick but not long-term strategic solutions in the face of constraints.
And when you say people, just to be clear, I mean, are you talking about specific individuals or people's approach to problems? Because I think one of the elements of this is that you can deliberately go from victim to neutralizer to transformer. But do you see certain types of people? Maybe you could, if there are people in the public domain, who are really good at this, or not? Yeah, well, our initial thought was there are some people who are just naturally very good at this, and some people who naturally just don't get it. And so if you look at, professional creative people, certain kinds of inventors, the Dysons of this world, they naturally see constraints as exciting and stimulating. Mm-hmm. And then there are others, to be honest, very often politicians, actually, who don't see them as exciting and stimulating, but see them as things to be managed and talked around and spun. So, you could argue that actually we should change those people over, really, that actually we should put Dyson in charge of most of our policies, because actually in the UK, for instance, we don't have
the abundance of resource we'd like. But nevertheless, that's not how politicians seem to work. It's how engineers work, but how politicians don't seem to work. So is that just to do with their personality, I guess was the question we asked.
Yep.
And then we had a really interesting, you take a hypothesis. When you're working with a book like this, you take a hypothesis out on the road and you start to test it with your interviewees. And we interviewed, roughly 50 people for the book in a wide variety of fields. And one of them was a guy in New York called Michael Beirut, who's a kind of rock star designer for a very famous design company called Pentagram. And I was bouncing this idea that there are three different kinds of people off him, transformers, neutralizers, and victims. And he said, well, look, my response to that is, and I'm somebody who solves problems all the time, and I every day in my work, I'm solving problems for my clients, is that actually I see all those three things in myself. I always start off when a constraint is imposed on me, and the challenge that I want to do, even though I solve problems for a living and I'm really good at it, and I know I'm good at it, I always see myself as a victim. My first reaction is, oh my God, how on earth can they expect me to do this under these circumstances? That's going to be almost impossible to do. And I get very grumpy and I stomp around a bit. And after a while, a couple of days, and my team have been staying clear of me at this point, after a while, we start saying, well, hang on, maybe there's a way through this. And then we start to think about it in a different way and bring different perspectives. And then, the constraint brings you to a kind of transformative solution. So he said, I think those are not three kinds of people. They are stages that people go through. And I think you'll find that everybody starts at the victim stage. And you need to recognize when you're facing a constraint or it's imposed on you, that is a place you will naturally start. That doesn't mean you can't get out of it. But he said what you'll find is people need help getting out of it because they don't know how to do it. They won't be sure it can be done. And perhaps they won't yet have the motivation to do it in the right kind of way. And part of what any study or any book or any resource like this needs to give them is the belief it can be done, just enough tools to do it, and some way of framing the motivation to themselves and their teams that'll make them want to do it in the right kind of way. So that then became the way that we outlined the book. And the book moves through helping people understand, first of all, how to frame the problem in a way that makes the constraint integral to the solution and a positive part of finding the solution. So it couples the constraint with a very big ambition. And by putting those two things together, creates a discomfort in the mind of the receiver. Because we're not used to having a big ambition and a constraint sitting side by side. We're used to, by and large, when we do brainstormings or workshops, the problem owner or the CEO or the CMO or the CFO, whoever it is, will say, let's take all the constraints out of the room and let's just think about what we'd like to be and how we'd like to be. And then tomorrow we can bring reality back into the room again. And what happens in that situation is you have a fantastically productive session and loads of ideas, and then there's this kind of bucket of iced water that's poured on it the following morning, and most of those things die. And what you find from people who are really good at making constraints powerful and stimulating is the opposite of that. They say, actually, no, let's put the constraint right in the middle of the room and couple it with this really steep ambition. And let's just look at the tension between those two things and how that makes us step back and rethink the way we have been approaching problems up to now, the data we've used, the questions we've asked, the teams we work with, the silos we operate in, the partners we have or don't have. It makes you re-examine in a more global way your whole kind of problem-solving approach. And that's obviously where the solutions start to come. So that was the first bit. The second bit that the book looks at really is a wonderful observation by a man called Colin Kelly, who's the chief technical officer at a bakery called Warburton's in the UK. Colin's a fascinating bloke. He came out of the nuclear energy business via Heinz in Russia, through into bread. And he's used to a very wide variety of different technical problems in different kinds of business. And he has this very simple technique that he told me about that I became fascinated by. He said, when we're trying to solve a really difficult problem that we don't know can be solved, he said, I don't allow anybody in the room, any of my team, to start a sentence with the words, we can't do that because. I make them start the sentence. We can do that if. Yep. And he said, I find it very, very powerful. And I was struck by this because it sort of chimed with some other things that I had been hearing about how Jonathan Ive, for instance, talks about the need to keep optimism and inquisitiveness alive at the same time in a problem. Because all the evidence suggests that actually the degree of optimism that you feel has a big bearing on the persistence and the grit further down the line with which you drive it through in the face of the speed bumps that you're going to have. So I was trying to think, okay, well, if you're going to deliberately have a very difficult question with a constraint in the middle of it, how do you keep optimism alive? And Colin's way of doing it, about making us talk about we can do that if, had a number of immediate benefits, right? So one was it keeps optimism alive in the conversation. The second is it makes all the energy of the conversation flow around where you need it to flow, which is how do we solve this as a problem, rather than allowing it to divert into a second question, which is this a problem that can be solved, which is not the question you want to have. And third, if you accept that as a culture, we are the stories that tell about ourselves. We tell about ourselves. The story that we Can-If tells about ourselves is that we are a group that finds solutions to problems, and the story that we Can't Because tells about ourselves is we are a group that's really good at finding reasons why things can't happen. So for all those three reasons, I became really fascinated by that and talked about it with my co-author Mark, and we then went back to the kind of 75 cases that we gathered from the 50 interviews that we'd done and said, well, can we see if there's a kind of commonality, if there are different kinds of Can-Ifs that seem to really pop on the most common kind. And we identified a group of kind of 9 or 10 that seemed to be the kind of the fulcrums for the kind of turning points for most of these organizations or teams, and identified a kind of a Can-If map, which is something that's kind of available and downloadable, and indeed in the book, for people to kind of use as a stimulus themselves as they kind of went forward. So we then started to have a kind of, I suppose, a way of thinking about how we move through these different stages from victim to transformer, how you frame the question, Can-If. The next question then came up, which is sort of really a subset of Can-If, I suppose, is all about an area which I know is kind of dear to your own heart, which is about kind of abundance and scarcity, and how, particularly in the Western world, we live in a world that a lot of us see as a post-abundance world. And I'm not even looking at it at kind of, a kind of macro resources kind of level, like water and energy and that kind of stuff. But just within business, we tend to think we have got tighter budgets and less time and less people than we used to have, and it's harder to attract talent than it was, and people stay with us less time and all those kinds of things. We tend to think of ourselves in something of a scarcity mindset because we have less than we used to. But clearly, if you are an entrepreneur, that's not how you see the world. You see your resources not as the budget you've been given or the people that report into you or anything like that. You see it as the money you can access and the network that you have and what you can get people to do for you if you can give them a reason to do it. So I became very interested in resourcefulness and what we called adjacent abundance. How do you, in order to overcome this constraint, and some of those constraints might be about money or time or people, how do you actually access other people's time, money, resources, and get them to be willing to let that to flow to you to deliver your kind of bigger ambition and prize? So there's a whole section about resourcefulness, and increasingly, I think and it's funny when you write a book, because often when you write a book, you're trying to find out what you think about the subject that you're writing about. And then you speak about it afterwards, and then you start to find out people's reactions to what you thought was the key point very often isn't the key point. And one of the things people are most interested in is this area of resourcefulness, and particularly resourcefulness in large organizations, to your starting point of the question, which is how do we get people in our organizations to be more resourceful? And I was very struck by a quote from the kind of Dean of Entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School, who defined entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. And I really like that definition because, a lot of us in a large organization define entrepreneurship as lots of things. Oh, it's about being self-starting, and it's about being kind of agile, and, the ability to go and talk to people and get stuff done. And he says, well, it isn't any of those things. It's actually just one very specific thing, which is the pursuit of resources, the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled.
So it's essentially resourcefulness, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But recognizing it, resourcefulness does not consist in the resources you've been given, but the resources you can access. And I think when he thought about that and when he coined that phrase, that was very much about entrepreneurs in relatively small organizations. But now if you look at it as a definition for large organizations, it's surely got to be a very exciting template for a capability that we can train and develop in our own companies. And surely most of us, because inevitably there are kind of points along the road where you think, what the stimuli for the book. One of the bits of stimuli for the book for me was actually, fun enough, being in Switzerland, sitting in a meeting where the president of a large global organization with a large presence in Switzerland addressed his team, and he said, this year we're going to need to do more with less. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the faces of the team in front of me, listening to this, and I could tell that what they interpreted that as meaning was, we're all going to have to work a bit later on Tuesday and Wednesday nights because, and they were already working till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, because he was giving no sense of what that actually meant. And I think in trying to unpack what resourcefulness means and how to bring that to life in a large organization, and indeed how to make constraints beautiful, that's in a sense part of the thing I'm trying to answer, which is there are too many corporate or CEO kind of easy go-to slogans like let's do more with less, and not enough of the serious unpacking by leadership of what it actually means. So anyway, the one final thought, I suppose, really was about then the emotional wrapping. As the sixth of the things that we're talking about, really, which is how do you create what we call activating emotions that make people, on the one hand, uncomfortable staying where they are and clinging to the paths that they've become dependent on and used to, and frankly that have got them promoted to where they are now, because all those paths that they've clung to and used so far to get to their solutions have been really good on their CV and have got them to this position and bought them that car and that mortgage and that life, but recognize that actually those are going to be yesterday's solutions for tomorrow's problems, and how do you get them to move on? So how do you create a combination of an emotion that's kind of exciting and positive on the one hand, gets them to want to move towards it, and also it's sufficiently uncomfortable to move away from where they are at the moment, and how do you bundle a narrative around that?
So those 6 steps, just to start, I mean, they fall under 3 sort of meta categories. One is mindset, which is the victim, neutralizer, transformer, and breaking this concept of path dependence, which we haven't gone into, but we'll make the book summary available so that people can dig into it. Then you've got method, which is the actual, the questions, the transformative questions, the can-if maps, the abundance piece, and then the final piece, as you say, is the emotions, which I guess is creating the energy, the tension between the hell of not doing something and the heaven of doing something to actually take you through that, to help you overcome the inevitable challenges of the journey, right? Is that
exactly?
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, because the emotion piece, I know it's the last one, but I mean that's fascinating, because that very rarely do you hear that kind of construct of the negative and the positive in the corporate environment. Anyway, I mean, I'm curious how has that which of these 6 steps, I guess, or levers? I mean, which ones have do you feel firstly have the biggest impact, and which ones are cause the most raised eyebrows or surprise when you're talking to clients in boardrooms for the first time?
So I think which have the biggest impact depends on whether one thinks which of the kind of 3 primary reasons that people are having difficulty moving from the victim to transform mindset in your company or organization or team. So, is it that they don't believe it can be done? In which case, certain of these things kick in. If they don't want to do it, then things like the activating emotion things become particularly important. And if they don't know how to do it, then more of the tools kick in. So I think that varies a bit as we go through.
But you don't pass go if you don't get into the transformer mindset. The rest of it's academic, essentially.
I think that's right, yeah.
Okay.
And you've got to bear in mind that you'll never get all of your people to be permanently in that full transform mindset. But there's a kind of a threshold of preparedness that you need to get your team to be in. That seems to be what characterizes a lot of these people most of the time. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that people go to most easily is the idea of can-if. Mm-hmm. They find that a very fresh and easy way to think about flipping what is usually a difficult and unconstructive conversation into a constructive conversation. So people seem to like and be energized by that. I think what people have a greater recognition of, but the most difficulty in doing, is your point about breaking path dependence. I think they realize that an organization has legacy habits, legacy biases, They themselves have ways of doing things, ways of asking questions, doing strat planning cycles, all that kind of stuff. But in a sense, because it's become best practice and they're running so hot and fast, that's the hardest thing to break. So that's the area that I have most difficulty in. And I think the thing that people are most excited by is this notion of creating abundance and how we genuinely get to be more resourceful. There's a very interesting, I don't know if you might have been interviewed him, Professor Lawrence Friedman, who wrote the book on strategy that came out a couple of years ago, where he looked at this kind of magisterial assessment of strategy and the development of strategy, all the way from chimpanzee colonies all the way through to through world history into contemporary politics and indeed the arts.
Yeah, I know we haven't had him on the show, no.
Well, he wrote this wonderful book called Strategy, which is a kind of a rather magisterial assessment of the evolution of strategy from chimpanzee colonies all the way through world history into contemporary politics and the arts. And he identifies a number of key strands of strategy across all of those different spheres and manifestations of it. And one of the three most important elements is alliance and coalition, and the ability to build alliances and coalitions. And I was interested in that particularly because clearly, if you're interested in challenges, which I am, that's my expertise, those are the clients that I work with, not doing it on your own, but having the ability to scale impact by partnering with other people, disproportionate to your own size, is clearly a critical capability. But equally because it's a manifestation of resourcefulness. But for it to be a manifestation of resourcefulness in a large organization, it can't be confined to the head of strategic partnerships who sits on floor C in block 5 and never really integrates with the rest of the organization except on a once-a-year basis. It has to be a capability that we all have. And it's not to be confused with building consensus within the organization. It's about how do I take what this project is all about, what the purpose of the organization stands for, why it's important, why it's absolutely critical this thing happens, and how do I use this to enlist people outside the organization to help us deliver it. That's a kind of resourcefulness and a skill base that I think will be right at the heart of every organization's capability building program in the future.
I mean, it's interesting. One of the reasons we call this show the innovation ecosystem is, I mean, beyond the four walls of the organization, there is this ecosystem out there. And I think to your point, the companies that are going to dominate in the future or prevail are the ones that can manage this ecosystem in a way that is far more sort of fluid and fungible than perhaps, in the old days they used to, their organization stops at the barriers at the four walls of their company, if you like.
I completely agree. No, I think that's absolutely right. And interestingly, I'm not sure what your perspective on this is, but I mean, made a distinction in the book, I suppose, between innovation and inventiveness. I think our sense was that innovation has rightly been positioned as absolutely central to an organization's health and vitality and growth. And at the same time, there's been so much emphasis placed on innovation with a capital I that it's now in some ways seen to be the province of very special people who are locked away in certain areas of the organization and, leave it to them, we'll deliver what they produce for us. And what we were interested in positing was that actually alongside innovation and organization, there's another kind of creativity, which we called inventiveness, which is actually everybody can practice, is not the province of specialized people. And maybe actually as part of your innovation ecosystem, you're effectively advancing the same thing from a different angle. And actually we need to be encouraging both kind of formal big I innovation and this smaller scale inventiveness, which is really characterized by the ability to make constraints beautiful, because each of those things in their own way is going to be fundamental to the future of the company, and neither of them on their own will be enough.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I end up talking to heads of R&D in large organizations, but if you're talking about intrapreneurship or you're talking about collaboration and mergers and acquisitions and incubators and accelerators, it's a far bigger piece. And then obviously building the culture of innovation or of inventiveness or of resourcefulness is right at the heart of every leader's sort of mandate. So I think, I tend to agree with you. It's a far bigger. Everyone ultimately is responsible for this kind of work if the organization is going to prevail, but also if they're going to, for them to extract a sense of purpose and a sense of value out of coming to work every day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that you were writing this book partly with your children in mind. I mean, what are the big things that have changed for you, having gone through the journey of writing the book, in terms of how you think, for instance, about? I mean, how do you, for instance, fast track yourself from victim to transformer? I mean, are there things that you're doing differently in your life, in your professional life, and in your personal life that have come about as a result of the book?
Yeah, I mean, some of it in the writing of the book, we had a particular constraint, which is that my co-author lives in San Francisco and I live in London. And initially I thought this would be so much easier if we were in the same place. We'd be able to sit together and have a couple of glasses of wine and talk about it. And I realized very quickly that actually what appeared to be the constraint of distance actually was a great boon, because if we were together, we just had a lot of time talking about it, not a lot of time writing it. So we moved into a system where I wrote for 8 to 10 hours during the day. Because of the time difference, I could send it to him. He read it. He then wrote. He sent it back to me. I picked it up in the morning. So we pursued a more kind of follow the sun kind of approach to writing, which was really good at rapid iteration and making sure we wrote over each other's stuff. So the whole book had one voice rather than two different voices. And then in launching the book, we said, okay, well, listen, we've got to kind of obey the precepts of the book. Let's set ourselves a target. Let's aim to sell 5,000 copies in the first 2 weeks with a marketing budget of zero. Let's set ourselves that kind of target. So let's give ourselves a constraint, no marketing budget, big ambition, 5,000 copies. That'll be enough to kind of give us some momentum in the United States. And how to think about how we're going to do that. And so we said to ourselves, okay, well, look, we came out of advertising. We've got lots of friends in advertising agencies. Let's ask them to throw parties for us. So let's say we're going to do a 2-week book launch tour. We're going to do, 12 to 14 events in those 2 weeks. They're all going to be free. We'd like to start in San Francisco. Let's ring up a couple of our friends at agencies and say, throw a party for us. It's January. This is going to be great for your client relationships. And they said, this has changed, Adam and Mark. We don't have those big budgets anymore. We can't afford to splash out on big parties in the middle of January. We just can't do that. We've got the fancy atrium. We've got the client list. We just don't want to spend the money on it. So we thought, okay, well, let's just play the little can if thing out of it. So we can actually get them to throw the party for us if the most expensive thing is free and the most expensive thing is booze. Great. Well, we've got booze clients. Let's go to our booze clients and say, I know there's a great chance for you to just lend us some booze and we'll throw the party at the agency and it'll be wonderful. And the booze clients goes, well, we're not just going to hand out free booze, So we had to reframe it for them. We had to say, well, actually, don't think of it as a freebie. Think of it as a great chance for you to take a launch of a new product and seed it within the Twitterati of the 4 most influential creative cities in the United States. And they did. And this wonderful vodka brand, Sky, did a global launch of a new product line. They were kind enough and generous enough to give us a kind of a very theatrical bar. It was all about mixology. And they gave us a brand ambassador called Felix, who was a magnificent man with a wonderful eye for the ladies. And he came along to every single event, and it just made it a much bigger, more interesting thing. We did 14 events in 2 weeks in 4 cities, all entirely free, ending with an evening hosted at Google in New York on the sort of final Thursday, and then indeed something by Fast Company and Inc. on the Friday morning after that. And all of those things came because we asked the question in a completely different way. And that experience completely changed my perception of the abundance and scarcity in my business life and indeed my personal life. And it's had a profound effect on me. So I've really taken that through into how I think about framing problems and deliberately introducing constraints to make myself think more creatively about what's available to me.
Fascinating. And the activating emotions, the last step. I mean, any example? I mean, presumably there are stories. You've got some experiences of where you were wondering whether you're going to sell any books because something hadn't worked. I mean, where does that? How did that manifest itself on that? The journey to 5,000 book sales.
Well, yeah. I mean, clearly you have a lot of low moments where you think this is going to be really embarrassing. Having told our friends at 14 different companies in the United States that we're planning to do this might not work. So it forces you to put to overcommit, if you like, to the amount of energy and attention you put into it. But also, more generally, I think within a company or an organization, I think you'll recognize this within your own situation, which is, I set out my stall as being around challenges and challenger brands in 1999. The book, Eating the Big Fish, at the time was the one that popularized the whole concept of challenger brands. Nobody talked about it before then. And the thing about having a company that bases itself around that is it's very exciting and you get slightly paranoid. So you're operating between these two emotions. On the one hand, as the concept of challenger brands becomes bigger and bigger, you think, this is great. The world is full of opportunity for us. And you paint an image to your group and to your team about all the possibilities that are out there. On the other hand, you're also worried it's going to become just another business fad, and the whole challenger thing will be part of a conversation that happened in the mid-2000s, but is no longer relevant now. So what you do, the way it drives you to behave as a business and as a business owner, is to be constantly refreshing and renewing that conversation. So at one level, the production of A Beautiful Constraint and the thinking in it was a desire to refresh and renew the importance of challenges in the world and give people a new way of thinking about what had become a very familiar conversation. So in a sense, that tension between excitement and desire, and on the other hand, fear of imminent and catastrophic doom, is really what drove me forward, and I'm sure at some level drives any entrepreneur like you forward as well.
Well, I mean, yeah, because what you're talking about is the Stockdale paradox, right? Have you heard the Admiral Stockdale, who was stuck in a prisoner of war camp for 8 years?
No.
And he looked at why is it that some people, why did some people manage to survive that traumatic experience over many years? And the paradox, I mean, it's basically around, retaining faith that you're going to prevail in the end. So be optimistic, but at the same time confront the most brutal facts of the current reality, whatever they may be. And the people who actually survived were able to hold that tension between the hell and the heaven, and that was the reason that retrospectively he thinks he survived and many of his colleagues didn't. So
that's interesting.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating, and I think and I certainly coming out of the corporate world and launching this, what started as a passion project, which is now developing into something quite significant and quite relevant, is a day doesn't go by without riding that roller coaster, and that's why I found this tool or your approach so fundamentally fascinating. So I'm curious. I mean, for the intrapreneur sitting in a large organization, wrestling with how to advance a project, how to get resources, how to help, for instance, their team become more inventive or entrepreneurial. What kind of advice would you give them? What tools, for instance, could you make available? Would you suggest they grab to really start making a meaningful step forward, but recognizing that it would just be the first step? Where would they start?
So for me, a lot of it starts with how we frame the problem and how we frame the question. I think most of us have become so tuned by the pressures of business and the pressures of work to move straight to finding solutions that we don't spend enough time thinking about what the question should be. And in kind of exploring the book, it became very clear that actually one of the fundamental things that drives resourcefulness and indeed successful entrepreneurialism is how that question is framed, because it forces you then to push out of the things that you and the organization have been doing historically and find new ways of doing them and new resources to do them with. So this is where the notion of a propelling question comes in, really. And I'm calling it a propelling question because it's framed in such a way that both you, the entrepreneur, and indeed the organization as a whole is unable to answer that question simply by doing the things you've been doing to answer your last 4 or 5 questions. And a propelling question essentially is a very big ambition, a stretch ambition, and a significant constraint put together in the same question. Mm-hmm. So how can we build a well-designed, durable table that we can make and sell for €6, for instance, in the case of IKEA? How can we make a well-designed table that costs twice the price of the disposable coffee cup you're going to put on top of it? Or how can we, in the case of kind of Audi, how can we make an engine for the new S8 that is faster than the previous engine, but at the same time is more fuel efficient, because the consumer won't buy it unless it's faster and the regulator won't let us produce it unless it's more fuel efficient. So these kinds of questions make us very uncomfortable and productively uncomfortable, because we can't answer them by just following the processes we used for the past 4 or 5 questions. From the point of view of resourcefulness, a lot of these questions are to do with how can I achieve this big ambition when I don't have a marketing budget, or when I don't have an innovation department, or when I only have half the sales resource of everybody else. Mm-hmm. And that leads you, as long as that question has got genuine authority, it's being asked by somebody who demands an answer and the organization has to come up with an answer for. As long as it has legitimacy, people understand why that person is answering it, and there's a reason for it. And specificity, that's to say it's not just a general question about how we can do more with less. It's a very specific question about how we can achieve this target with this little resource. It forces you to look beyond the resources you've been given and the people you've been given, because the question is a mandate. I have to answer it, but I have to look outside what I've got. And that leads you to look at adjacent abundance. It leads you to say, what are the partnerships I've got? What's the network I've got? What's the resources I've got, both within the organization and indeed more broadly within our partners and then outside our partners, but people who can be motivated to join our purpose and be excited by our purpose and want to allow their resources to flow to us to deliver this bigger purpose, this purpose is bigger than both of us. That's where it starts to get exciting and motivating. And there's been a lot of conversation about purpose and why purpose is motivating and valuable in an organization, but there's not enough conversation, I think, about why it's not simply valuable within an organization, but why it actually allows you to attract, almost like a magnet, the resources from around you and other interested parties who would want to give to a purpose that was bigger than an individual company, because they themselves were valuable, found that valuable as well. And I do think that's been one of the things that hasn't been talked about enough with that.
And so I mean, it sounds like this is. I mean, there is art and science to putting this question together, and it's not a straight. It requires quite a lot of work, to focus on the ambition, but also on the constraint to ensure that it's sufficiently specific. And any live examples that you can just take us through, just to give the intrapreneur again who might be listening, who might be feeling under-resourced, surrounded by sort of disempowering questions versus compelling questions. Any advice, any example from some client work that you've done, just to show what they went through and what value was unlocked by the propelling nature of the question, but also by the ability to attract resources around this question, around this purpose?
Well, I think there's a lovely story that was told when we did the launch by the marketing director of Virgin America at launch, and Virgin America was obviously a domestic airline in the States and was trying to reintroduce what they called glamour back into American domestic air travel, which had been improved somewhat by the introduction of new players like JetBlue, but still wasn't quite at anything like a kind of transatlantic level of pleasure. And they'd spent a lot of time, Virgin America, getting the mood lighting right on the airline, and they discovered that actually this kind of wonderful purple glow of mood lighting as you got on the plane communicated a sense of both calm, but also this kind of sense of glamour and being a little bit more kind of hip and cool and make you feel better about yourself. But they'd spent so much money creating that experience that the marketing director didn't really have the marketing budget to compete against the very, very large amounts of money that places like people like Southwest were about to spend on it. So her challenge was, I know this is a trigger. I know if I can show people this visual of the purple mood lighting, this is a kind of a trigger to trial. I just don't have the marketing budget to really kind of do lots of advertising to portray that. So she had to effectively say, how can I get other people to give me their resources that will make the media and my consumers do this messaging for me, show this picture for me? So they sat down and they looked at what we got. What we got is a kind of a plane. It's got effectively an aisle down the middle. That's sort of like a catwalk down the middle, really. So what could we put in a catwalk that would make people take pictures of us? Well, to cut a long story short, they said we could partner with Victoria's Secret on Victoria's Secret's budget rather than our own. They'll do a catwalk show on a flight from one coast to the other. It'll be very interesting visually to the passengers on it. They'll take lots of pictures of it and show it to their friends. And indeed, the media will take lots of pictures of it and show it to their friends. And when you see that kind of array of images that came out of it, at one level, it looks like just a brilliant PR stunt for Virgin. And actually, it's much more strategic than that. It's a way of getting other people's resources to show an image of your purple mood lighting, which is a trigger for trial, to a much broader swathe of consumers. And they did that consistently with all sorts of partnerships. They partnered with Google, piloting the Chromebook. They were based in San Francisco, so they had access to a whole bunch of kind of newer tech in Silicon Valley. They premiered an episode of Entourage with HBO where they kind of dressed the plane and they had the stars on the plane, and again got lots of people to take the photographs of the cabin. And they found lots of ways, innovative ways, of getting creating an event within the cabin that got the media to show pictures of this purple mood lighting. So it's just a brilliant example of it. And that, of course, is not purpose-based per se. That's just about taking an idea and really interesting partnerships. But even in coming back to this point about partnerships, in most companies, the person in charge of partnerships is in block 5, floor C, and you never actually see them. How you actually drive a much greater sense of enabled partnerships as an entrepreneur with an organization is one of the things that really defines whether you can make this resourcefulness actually happen or not.
Yep. So, I mean, wonderful. What we'll do is we'll include, some of the tools in the show notes, and really, I think it is hugely empowering for people listening who are perhaps under the incorrect assumption that the lack of resources is a stumbling block, as you say. It can actually open up all sorts of opportunities if one thinks about them differently, and in a more connecting the ambition to the overall constraint. It sounds like the way that these people in Virgin certainly managed to do this. So if I can just begin to wrap this up, Adam, with the 3 questions I sent through to you beforehand. First question. What have you changed your mind about recently?
So one of the things I've changed my mind about recently is what is ethical and unethical in business. So I run a small company. We've never worked on tobacco. We've never worked on factory farms. And I sort of imagined that would be the limit of it. Increasingly, as I look at what's happening with automation, I'm wondering whether automation is going to become, and should become, for us at least, and perhaps a broader swathe of businesses, another thing that we object to work on. So, for instance, a colleague of mine was saying that they'd been working on a consultancy project for a large retailer that was looking at totally automated local stores. Where not simply was there no human presence at the checkout, but actually everything else about the store was automated. And at some point we have to say that is simply unethical. That is going to destroy small communities and simply take away jobs to a point where it doesn't make sense for society and we should not support it. So that's one of the big shifts. I'm very, very uncomfortable about the way that automation is going and what it means for us as a society. And I think I've changed my view about that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as you talk, I mean, I think of places where automation is appearing. It's in the hotel industry, obviously in the car industry. I mean, there are lots of, not in the factories, in the warehouses. I mean, it seems like that does seem like a constraint that you'll be putting on your business if one believes, the futurists talking about the impact that automation is going to have on vast swathes of society.
Yeah, I just don't think we're doing it in a considered enough way. And we're not thinking of it as an organization as businesses that serve society, rather than simply that serve the shareholder. I don't think we're thinking about it in a balanced way. My perspective of the world is the world has become unbalanced in very significant ways. And part of the responsibility of a good business is to preserve that balance. And I don't think we are considering it in a balanced enough way.
Yep. Okay. And second question, what do you do to remain, innovative and creative?
I find that a large part of my work, as you know, is like yours, talking to people. And I find that actually the most excited I get is when I've gone and talked to somebody who's doing something really interesting and I've heard their particular perspective on the world, and you've walked in their shoes for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, however long it is. And I'm enormously excited by that. And if I can get a chance to actually talk to a group of those people in the course of quite a condensed time, 2, 3, 4 days, and start to kind of generalize from the particular and start to create new models, new ways of seeing the world, that's the most exciting and refreshing and rejuvenating thing I can do.
Yep. Fully understand. And then the final question, Adam, to what do you attribute your success in life? I mean, are there any specific skills or habits or mindsets that you've mastered that have really made a significant impact?
I think there's a couple of them, really. So the first is, I think that primarily in the days where they used to ask you to put your profession in the passport, I would like to write in my profession in that slot, tool maker. So I don't really think of myself as a thinker or a book writer. I think of those as being tools that are useful for people. And so I think genuinely being useful and creating frameworks and tools that are a bridge from the particular theory or the particular study into something they can do in their everyday life, I think is something that's been right at the heart of the business I've created and the pleasure I've got out of creating it. It's been fundamental. The second thing, I think, is the ability to be genuinely curious in everything. I find that one of the big differences between really good people in the organization that I have and people who are very able, but perhaps aren't going to achieve their full potential is that the latter are not able to be interested in everything. They're very selective curiosity. And I think actually you need to be naturally curious in everything or be able to be curious in everything. And therefore, because only if you're genuinely curious in it, can you actually listen to it. And I think the third thing is that point about listening, really. I think I'm still shocked by how poor most of the business world is at listening and how much it places emphasis on talking. And I think I'm a really good listener.
And on that curiosity point, I mean, do you have a view on whether curiosity can be taught or nurtured? I mean, what do you do for, if you've got a high potential talent who's struggling in your organization with being curious, is there anything that you feel that you've been able to do to help them bring it forward a little bit more?
I think you have to make it personal for them. You have to say, I understand at the moment there is no personal connection between you and this category. What you need to find is what personally could interest you about that category. And I think if you work with somebody to help them find the personal connection, whether it's the nature of the problem, it's not a problem they've had to solve before. So even if they're not interested in the category, it's a new kind of problem for them. Whether it's actually the importance of solving this problem to the people that actually are coming to one and wanting to be one's clients. So in that case, establishing a relationship that one likes about them, that means that you like them so much you want to solve the problem for them. I think you have to help them find what is the cue and what is the trigger for that interest, and then everything else follows.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Adam, I mean, it's been great having you on the show. I'm sure our guests our audience will have enjoyed it as much as I did. What we'll do is we'll put some materials in the show notes so that people can find more from you. Perhaps you could just let us know where can people go to get in touch with you? Have you got what's your website and your Twitter handle?
Yes, the website is eatbigfish.com. And my Twitter handle is @eatbigfish. EATBIGFISH, or they can just contact me directly at adam@eatbigfish.com, and I'm delighted to follow up with any answers to any questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to hearing you when we get the show out in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, this is Mark again. I love listening to that interview again. I was really struck by how Adam deliberately introduces constraints into his life to help him become more creative and more resourceful. I love the real life examples of the book launch and how he leveraged his ecosystem and how that completely changed his perception of abundance and scarcity in his business and his personal life. And of course, the tools, some of which we'll include in the show notes, along with the summary of the book, well worth grabbing hold of them and start seeing how you can use, for instance, the CANIF map, or the propelling question, or the victim neutralizer transformer journey to really unlock some of your innovation activities. So plenty here. Hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, this knowledge is not power, it's only potential power. So urge you to grab those tools, get a copy of the book, or at least the review of the book, and just hopefully you'll find it as valuable as I did. I think this is a tremendous resource for all of us, and I wish I'd discovered it sooner, to be honest with you. A friend of mine suggested I interview Adam, and I'm hugely grateful that she gave me that suggestion, and it's great that Adam could come on the show. Feel free to leave a review on our site and download any additional resources www.innovationecosystem.com. Until then, have a great week.